Hello, my name is Cassius Amicus, and I'm here to give you a presentation today briefly on the topic of an Epicurean response to Plato's attack on pleasure. Before we get started, I do want to thank the Epicurean Garden of Athens for this opportunity to speak with you for a few minutes. I particularly want to thank several members of the Greek Gardens of Epicurus who've been helpful to me in the past and inspirational to me over the years in my study of Epicurus. First of all, Christos Yapiakis himself, of course, who continues to lead the Epicurean project forward in Greece and hopefully around the world soon as well. Also, Takis Takaridis, who's been helpful to me many times in the past, especially in getting connected online with some of your seminars in the past. And then also Eli Pensa, who's been participating regularly over the years with our English language Epicurean work on the Facebook, as well as in some of our private forum discussions. I've come to count on Ellie over the years as a good friend and a trusted advisor, and I want to particularly thank her for all of the inspiration she's been for me over the years in the study of Epicurus. My own connection to the Epicurean world over the last 10 years has been on the internet mostly, and my primary project at the moment is an online discussion forum by the name of epicureanfriends.com. It's focused on English language, but we have a group of people there who are constantly talking back and forth about the details of Epicurean philosophy and how to apply it in the modern world. And of course, we invite you who are members of the Greek Forum to participate as well. One of the things that we run into is that we find, of course, we try to get new people in all the time in the forum, and we run into common questions that especially new students of Epicurus want to talk about. And one of them that recurs almost as much as anything else is the issue of the greatest good. What does Epicurus mean when it is said that when he says, or people say about him, that he held pleasure to be the greatest good? I'm going to talk for just a few minutes tonight about some of the insights that have come up from our discussions on the forum about that topic. There's many ways to approach the question, but what I want to suggest to you today is that it's important for you to consider the arguments of the philosophers who came before Epicurus about pleasure. And predominantly, we're focusing on Plato, who had argued strongly that pleasure cannot be the goal or the guide or the greatest good of life. A lot of people who come into our forum discussions, they're not aware of this background in which Plato had set out specific arguments against pleasure. They're not aware of all of Plato's dialogues by any means, and they don't understand or haven't even heard of the Philebus dialogue, which is one of the most important for this discussion of Plato's attacks on pleasure. Philebus contains several important arguments that we're not going to have time to talk about tonight, but there's one in particular that we do have time to talk about that I would like to at least introduce to you as something very important to keep in mind as you study Epicurus. In Philebus section 27e, Plato has Socrates engaging in a discussion with his students, and Philebus in particular is arguing the position that pleasure is the highest good. And Plato has Socrates ask this question. Socrates says, "Well then, what of your life, Philebus, of unmixed pleasure?" Again, Philebus has been arguing that the life of pleasure is the highest life. "In which of the aforesaid classes may it properly be said to belong?" And what that means is that Socrates has been suggesting certain categories to place these competitors in and wants to know what class we can consider pleasure to belong to. But then Socrates says, "Before you tell me, please answer this question." And Philebus responds, "Ask your question." Socrates then asks this. The question is, have pleasure and pain a limit, or are they among the things which admit of more or less? And this is the kind of question that tends to make people's eyes glaze over unless they're professional philosophers. And I'm not so sure that even professional philosophers don't get tired of talking about details like this. But in the common and ordinary readership world of Epicurus, the discussion of having a limit is something that people do not ordinarily do. But it is important to Plato and Socrates here, and this is what we're going to discuss is the reason why. Philebus's answer to that question is yes, they, meaning pleasure and pain, are among those which admit of the more, Socrates, for pleasure would not be an absolute good if it were not infinite in number and degree. So what we've got going on here is that Philebus thinks that it supports the idea of pleasure being the best life by saying that pleasure is infinite. Well, that's the wrong answer, according to Plato and Socrates. And they're going to go into a lot of detail in Philebus in explaining why. But for purposes of our discussion tonight, we can collapse their explanation into another statement by another famous philosopher who took the same position. We can look to Seneca, the Roman Stoic, in his Letters to Lucilius, and in number 66.45, we see the same argument being advanced in very clear terms and more concisely than Socrates does, because Socrates never does anything concisely. He beats around the bush, which explains why the Epicureans were not fans of Socrates. What Seneca does in a concise manner is this in the letter to Lucilius, and this is a quote: "What can be added to that which is perfect?" And the answer is nothing. If it's perfect, it doesn't need anything else. Nothing. Otherwise, that was not perfect to which something has been added. In other words, if you could add something to it and make it better, then what was there before was not perfect. Nor can anything be added to virtue either. For if anything can be added thereto, it must have contained a defect. Honor also permits of no addition, for it is honorable because of the very qualities I've mentioned. What then? Do you think that propriety, justice, lawfulness do not also belong to the same type, and that they are kept within fixed limits? And so far in this paragraph, what Seneca is arguing is that the virtues are basically superlatives. They cannot be increased in splendor or worth by adding something to them. They are complete in themselves. Virtue is its own reward. But this is the kicker to the argument. The ability to increase is proof that a thing is still imperfect. Now, there are many people in our Epicurean forum discussions who don't like to get into logic games and logical arguments like this. But in the course of a Platonic dialogue, that's what they specialize in. And the argument being made here is that if a thing can be made better, then that means that it was not perfect in the first place. So you're still looking for your greatest good if the good that you're suggesting can be made better. And that's where Philebus has stepped into the trap, because by admitting that pleasure can be made better by adding more pleasure to it, he's admitted that what was there before, his definition of pleasure, cannot be the greatest good. Plato's arguing that pleasure, therefore, is not the highest good or the greatest good or the goal of life or anything like that, because looked at logically, the word pleasure alone has no limit. It can be made better by adding something else to it. So in this context of this discussion, what I would suggest is that you should think about whether there is a statement that's famous in Epicurean philosophy that sounds like it could be a response to this specific argument of Plato about limits. Again, limit is something that seems very dry and unemotional and uninteresting even to talk about in the field of ethics. But that's exactly what Plato is doing here in using it to attack pleasure. And what I would suggest to you to think about is that Principal Doctrine 3 of Epicurus is exactly on point to this issue. Principal Doctrine 3 in this translation by Cyril Bailey from 1926 is this, quote, "The limit of quantity in pleasures is the removal of all that is painful." Now, the doctrine continues on and says that when pleasure is present, then there's neither pain of body or mind or both at once. But for purposes of this discussion, the first sentence is the key part, because Epicurus is saying in distinction and in contradiction to Plato that pleasure does have a limit, that there's a limit to the quantity that you can have. I would suggest it's pretty obvious that what he's talking about here is that the human life, we have a finite human lifespan. There's only so much experiences of pleasure or pain that we can experience in one lifetime. Epicurus has said in the letter to Herodotus, Diogenes Laertius has recorded for us that Epicurus held that there are only two feelings, pleasure and pain. And so looked at from a logical point of view, if you remove all that is painful from your life, then you cannot do anything more than that, because by removing the pain, you have placed in that place pleasure. So the most pleasure you can possibly have is a life from which all pain has been removed. This is not something that is ambiguous or abstract or difficult to understand or dark. It really is in my view, direct refutation of Plato's argument that pleasure has no limit. Now, you may choose to decide that that's not an important question for you, that whether pleasure has a limit or whether a greatest good cannot be increased, those may seem like dry abstractions to you. But in the world of philosophic wars in ancient Greece, these kind of questions were of the utmost importance to their students. And so why is this answer significant to us today? What I would suggest is that when we get caught up in looking at Principal Doctrine 3 and wonder why it is phrased the way it is, we can look to the Platonic background for an answer to that. In other words, was Epicurus saying that the removal of all that's painful, was Epicurus saying that absence of pain is all we need to know about the best life? Is absence of pain a full and complete definition of the highest good towards which we all strive in our lives? A related question would be, you think of pleasure being the greatest good as something that Epicurus is identified with, but that phrase is not in the Principal Doctrines. It's certainly not anywhere near the top of them. And why is that? I would suggest to you that what Epicurus is doing in these opening Principal Doctrines is refuting other schools. He's refuting the religionists who argue that there is a supernatural God. He's refuting also the religionists who think that there's a life after death where you'll be punished or rewarded for your actions in this life. And then when he gets to Principal Doctrine 3, I'm going to suggest to you that he is actually specifically refuting this Platonic argument. He is saying that there is a limit to pleasure, and that limit to pleasure, once you understand it, removes the obstacle of Plato and their argument that says pleasure is not the greatest good. So one possible answer to all of this is that Epicurus is directly responding to Plato in his formulation of Principal Doctrine 3 by saying that pleasure does in fact have a limit. So as we begin to close this brief presentation, I just want to suggest to you that when you read Epicurus's doctrines, in addition to just reading different translations and studying the text as close as you can, you also need to know what's going on in the background, what arguments Epicurus was responding to. And I'm sure most of the people in this symposium are very well educated and don't need me to tell them that. But there are a lot of people in beginning to study Epicurus who don't take the time to do that background research. They need to know what Plato was arguing and why he was arguing it, and what the deal with limits is in the first place. Philebus gave the wrong answer. And because of that, Socrates chased him away from his position and caused him to admit that pleasure is not the highest goal. Philebus walked away from the truth that Epicurus then came and picked up and showed us how to defend in later times. So don't just take phrases like pleasure is the greatest good at their face value. They're obviously very deep in philosophic meaning, and it's necessary for you to understand the background in order to get the full benefit out of Epicurean positions like this in your own life. So we do as Epicurus suggested, and as you've probably heard many times during the course of this symposium and other symposiums. In the letter to Menicius, he says, meditate therefore on these things and things akin to them night and day, by yourself and with a companion like yourself. And never shall you be disturbed waking or asleep, but you shall live like a god among men. For a man who lives among immortal blessings is not like unto a mortal being. It's that give and take, that constant discussion, that constant interaction with friends that brings the most enjoyment in life and the most satisfaction in dealing with all of these problems that we run into in the modern world. And with that, thank you for your time tonight. I invite you to drop by Epicurean Friends and participate there if you like. But again, thank you for the invitation to speak with you, and I wish you the best in the rest of your symposium. Thank you and good night.